and welcome to the 4th episode of the HERBGARDEN knitwear podcast. My name is Hanna and this is a podcast all about knitting. I will show you what I'm currently working on, and today I have also a finished object that I can show you, and the informational segment of this episode will be all about swatching. I know this is a topic that really splits the knitter community. Some of us always swatch and some of us don't like to swatch at all. And so today I would like to address what swatching is actually for and how it can be helpful for your knitting projects, and also in which projects swatching is particularly important and in which projects you might be able to get away without swatching. Today I'm wearing one of my absolute favorite designs. This is my Vivyen Sweater, which I released only a couple months ago. And it is made from a GOT certified cotton and merino yarn. It is this one. Oh, it's getting blurred out. It's Austermann cotton merino. And I worked this sweater on 3.5mm needles. It starts with this beautiful twisted rib around the neck, and this twisted rib then transitions into a cable pattern with lovely bobbles here, and up until this point you work the sweater like a circular yoke sweater, and then it transitions into a raglan style sweater. And I made this decision because that always helps with the fit. And as all my sweater patterns, this one is available in at least 10 sizes. You can find this pattern on Ravelry and on my website if you're interested, and I will link it down in the description box below. I'm really happy with this one. It's a super light sweater and has also this lovely twisted rib here on the cuffs and here on the body as well. And see how lovely and drapey this fabric is. I really like it a lot. Some of you have told me that they actually like the sweater, but they prefer sweaters that have wider necklines. That is not a problem at all. You can just make it wider yourself. For example, you could look at the pattern at the section where the first increase round is described, which should be somewhere around here. And you could just skip the first part and use the number of stitches that you have after you made the first increase round, and just cast on this number of stitches to have a wider neckline. That would be one option to easily modify this pattern to your own preferences. So this one is really one of my absolute favorites. I love the yarn, I love the drape it creates. I think it's very elegant and it's also very comfy. I really like to wear it while I'm working, and this is one of my happy sweaters. The most exciting part of this episode, at least for me, is that I am able to show you a finished object. I have actually finished this lovely spring sweater over there, which is not its actual name. It's kind of just a working title that I have been using lately. I'm still looking for a name for this one. I got some lovely suggestions over on Instagram, where you can also find me as HERBGARDEN knitwear. And I'm very, very happy with this design. It has this lovely wide neckline that is surrounded with a lace pattern that I really enjoy quite a lot. It has 3/4 length sleeve that hit just a little bit below the elbow, and as the body they are finished off with this lovely garter rib band, which what you can not see right now maybe is that I have worked some short rows in the back, both around the neckline, which might be visible a little bit because the neckline is quite a bit lower in the front and a little bit higher in the back. But I have also included short rows on the lower part of the body, so that the back of the sweater is a little bit longer than the front, which I think looks very nice when you wear it with pants. Yes, so I hope that you will like it just as much as I do. And if you have name suggestions, I would be very interested to hear them. Please drop me a comment down below. And I think I will be able to work on this pattern next, as the test of the Creative Flow shawl ended last weekend. So I always try to have not more than 2 patterns in testing at a time, because I don't think I would be able to manage everything around the test, like discussing certain things that come up in the chat room, answering messages. That is actually something that is very time consuming, so I do not have more than 2 patterns in testing at the same time. And since, well, this one is now ready to be released, I hope to release it within this week. So depending on what time you see this episode, it might already be released or coming very, very soon. Yeah, so since this is done, I am now able to start working on a new pattern, and I think this summer design, spring sweater design, is the one I'm going to work on next. If you are interested in testing this sweater design when the pattern is ready, which will surely take me a few weeks until the test can start, but if you are interested, then please consider just following me on Instagram, because that is where I will announce the test when it starts. Well, what you also can do if you want to is joining my tester pool on Yarn Pond. Yarn Pond is a website where all my tests are hosted. It's a website especially for testing knit and crochet patterns. So if you're generally interested in being a test knitter, then you should definitely check that website out. It's really awesome, and it really helps a lot to organize the whole test. So you can join my tester pool there if you want to. I will link the Yarn Pond website below, and also my Instagram account, so there you can get updates on the state of the pattern, when it will be ready for tag editing, and then after that, when the test can start, I will share all that on my Instagram account. So there you can keep yourself up to date if you want to. So since I have finished one project, I was able to cast on a new one, which is always very exciting. And I have told you about these plans before, and now I have finally made the decision to cast on a hat made from this wonderful unspun yarn from Rain, Cloud and Sage. This is the Unspun 2104. And I hold 2 strands of these together with a regular silk mohair yarn. I believe I've shown this in a past episode as well. So I have 3 strands all together, and I am working on a new hat. And I feel like this might not be very easy to see right now. Maybe the swatch is easier to see. I am planning to do a lovely cable rip pattern. I don't know what to call it yet. So this is a very, very easy pattern, but I think it looks really, really nice, and it will make a wonderful, very squishy, lovely hat, and I really hope this works as I hope it will. As you see, I have made quite some progress already. I have like a section down here which is only rib, because I plan to have like a folded brim like this, and then I just started the cable pattern here. Yes, so far I really like it. I love the smell of this yarn. It's just to die for. It really makes me so comfortable, and I can't wait to well, knit on, finish this, and see if it works as I hope it will. So this is my very fun little knitting project, and I really enjoy working on larger needles. So this is a 6mm needle right here, and I really like to switch projects from a very or rather small needle for this sweater over there to like a chunky knit like this. That's really a lot of fun for me. Now let's get to the informational segment of this episode. Let's talk about swatching. I know this is something that not all knitters like to do, and I really hope that this segment helps you to maybe understand why swatching really does make sense. And to say this upfront, I am a big fan of swatching, and maybe in this episode I can convince you a little bit that it's actually not such an annoying thing that you might think it is. It really helps me a lot, and I have had great experiences with swatching, and maybe this helps you too. So let's start quickly with what swatching is and why we do it at all. So before you start a knitting project, you are advised by any designer at all, any designer, to knit a gauge swatch. And that is a tiny little square like this that you use to measure your stitches in a certain stitch pattern over a region of 10 by 10 centimeters or 4 by 4 inches. So you have a little square, and within this square you will count how many stitches you have on this area of 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and how many rows you have on as well 10 centimeters and 4 inches in most cases. So why do we do this? Well, all designers have measurements in their patterns, or at least they should have. Like if you have a sweater pattern, then they will tell you if you knit size 3, you will get a sweater of a certain bust circumference, upper arm circumference, and so on and so on. So if the pattern states a size, then it is absolutely crucial to gauge swatch, because this size that the designer wrote down in the pattern is based on a certain gauge. So if you want the item that you are knitting to be the size that is stated in the pattern that you're working, then you need to work it with the exact gauge as written in the pattern. It is not, in most cases, it is not enough if it is close to the gauge that is written in the pattern. It has to be exactly the same gauge as stated in the pattern, as even small differences can cause a major difference in the final measurement. So what is important about this? So I think there's an ongoing discussion about stitch gauge versus row gauge. Let's say the pattern says you should have 24 stitches, which is the stitch gauge, and 30 rows, which is the row gauge. Now I know that some people argue that row gauge is not as important as stitch gauge, and I do get that point, but I would actually disagree. So let me try to explain. Of course, stitch gauge, as we have just discussed, is very, very important, as it determines the measurements like the bust circumference, the upper arm circumference, any measurement that is based on a stitch count. So why is the row gauge equally as important as the stitch gauge? Let's have a circular yoke sweater as an example. You always need increases here in the yoke area to get the bust circumference that you want to have for the sweater. So it is probably obvious that the way the increases are positioned within this yoke is really not random. There are a few things to have in mind if you want to have a good fitting garment. So if your row gauge is off, then the position of the increase rounds will not be in the same place as intended by the designer. So the shaping of the yoke will be completely different. The same, for example, with the crown of a hat. If you have a different row gauge than stated in the pattern, the decrease rounds in the crown of a hat will be in a different place than intended by the designer. And that can, of course, cause a different shaped hat. So the only places or the only sections where row gauge is really not important is if you're working a piece that is worked straight without any increases. Let's say you have a body on a sweater that is worked straight down without any waist shaping or something like that. That is a case where, of course, row gauge is not as important as stitch gauge, because you can just add rows as you go. But within a yoke where you have increases, you would actually, if you would want the exact same fit of the finished item as the designer intended, you would actually have to count the rows between each increase round, or the rounds between each increase round, and then you would have to recalculate them with your own row gauge and then reposition all the increase rounds, which of course, depending on the stitch pattern on the yoke, is very, very hard to do. So what I was trying to say is row gauge is just as important as stitch gauge as soon as you work an item that has increasing or decreasing in it. So maybe that's something to keep in mind for future projects. So if your gauge is this important, how can you make a gauge swatch that is as accurate as possible? First of all, you should always use the exact same needles and the exact same yarn that you are going to use for the actual project. Don't use, like, for example, metal needles for the swatch and then wooden needles for the project. That can cause huge difference in the two gauges. Then something that you should also keep in mind is that you should always work a gauge swatch that is larger than the usual 10 by 10 centimeter square or 4 by 4 inch square. So making a swatch of this size, for example, can only help you when it comes to questions like how do you like the stitch pattern, or how does the yarn feel. But a swatch of this size will definitely not work as a gauge swatch for measuring your actual gauge, because it is way too small. Many of you might have made the experience that they did swatch before they made a project, and then when they actually worked the project, when it was a larger project like a sweater or a shawl, that they have discovered that their gauge changed a little bit between the swatch and the actual project. And that can be, of course, because of the amount of stitches that you have. Like the more stitches you have, the more accurate your gauge will become. So you always need to make a gauge swatch that is significantly larger than the requested 10 by 10 centimeter or 4 by 4 inch square. And if the item that you want to knit has a certain stitch pattern, then you need to work at least one complete repeat of that stitch pattern. Like for example, here is like a lace stitch pattern swatch, and as you can see, it is much larger than the 10 by 10 centimeters 4 by 4 inches, because if I had worked the swatch smaller, then I would not have had at least one complete repeat. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Your swatch always needs to have at least one repeat, and as I said before, the bigger the swatch, the more accurate it will become. Then another thing that you should do is, if you work your project flat, then you should also make a flat gauge swatch. And if you work your project in the round, then you should definitely swatch in the round. For many people, their knit stitches and their purl stitches have quite a difference in height. If you want to find out if that is the case for you, you can just make an experiment using the same yarn and the same needles, making one swatch that you only work in the round, and I will show you in a minute how you can swatch in the round without making a huge swatch. And you can make a second swatch with the same needle and the same yarn that you work back and forth, and then you can see whether those two swatches actually have the same gauge. That is a way to find out if that might be an issue for you. But even if you have checked that and you have experienced no difference between those two methods, I still recommend that you always swatch in the same way that you are planning to work the project, as it can differ between different kinds of yarn and also with the different needles. So always swatch in the way that you are going to work the project, either flat or in the round. So now let me quickly show you how you can swatch in the round without having to knit a huge circumference like a hat or something. By the way, there are people out there who actually swatch yoke patterns or something like that by making a hat, so that would be an option as well. But if you want to avoid that, then here's what you can do. So far I have only cast on a few stitches. Obviously this is way too little for an actual swatch, as I have already mentioned, but I just wanted to demonstrate this quickly, so here we are. So now this is my working yarn, while this is the tail. Usually when I would knit flat, I would now just work in this direction as I just cast on. But now I'm not going to do that. Instead, I am going to pull my needle all the way through in a similar way as you would knit an I-cord. And now the working yarn is attached to this side here, to this side, and I'm simply going to work this end without pulling the working yarn very tight. So let me quickly show that to you. So I will just I hope you can see that. I'll just have the working yarn here in the back. I hold it loose, and then I will just knit a row. So now you might be able to see that the yarn actually runs here in the back, like this. And if I want to work the next row, I do it again. I simply just pull my needle all the way through till the other end and knit from the same end as I was before. always make sure that the yarn that has now these long strands on the back of the work is not too tight. So I hope you can see that. I do have these strands here just lying there on the back. And when you are done, you can simply cut those strands here in the back. What you need to be aware of when you knit this way, that the stitches on the edges, so the very first 2 or 3 stitches on both sides, are usually much looser than in the center of the swatch. So with this technique, you you always need to make sure that you have enough stitches on both sides of the swatch that you do not measure. This one is an example where I actually did swatch in the round. So as you can see, I have those strands here just dangling out of my swatch. You do not have to secure these stitches. You can just so when I finished it, they were attached like this, and I just cut them open. And as you can see, the edge stitches are a little loose and wonky. That's totally fine. This is why this swatch is so wide. I would only measure like in this section here in the middle, not those edge stitches here. So I really hope this helps. And the final thing that you should do with your swatch to make it accurate is to treat it in the exact same way that you are going to treat the finished object. So if you have a sweater that you plan to wear and wash every now and then you should definitely wash your swatch in the exact same way. If you're planning to do a shawl that you are planning to steam block, then you should definitely steam block your swatch in the very same way. I have seen many people pinning down their swatches while blocking. That is something that I would be really careful about. If you have a lace shawl that you are going to pin as well when it is done, then you can and should do the same thing with your swatch. But if you are swatching for a sweater, like a stockinette sweater, that you are not going to pin down while blocking, then you should definitely not pin down that swatch either. So you always treat your swatch in the exact same way, using the exact same products like wool wash or something like that. Treat it in the exact same way that you're going to treat the finished object. And only afterwards you can count your stitch and your row gauge. Now let's say you have knit up your swatch and have made it reasonable size and treated it exactly the same way that you treat your final project, and now you want to measure your stitch and your row gauge. How do you do that? Well, the first thing to keep in mind, which is kind of obvious but still very important, you have to lay your swatch down on a flat surface. Don't ever measure your gauge while the swatch is sitting on your lap or on a magazine or something like that. You really want a very flat surface, like a table or something like that. The floor maybe, doesn't matter. You can use any kind of measuring device to count your stitches and your rows. I have like a little square, 10 by 10 centimeter square like this, but you can just as well use any kind of ruler or tape measure or whatever you have at hand. Then you will lay your measuring device over your swatch, and then you will count both the stitches and the rows. If your swatch is large enough, I recommend moving your measuring device across the swatch and write down the gauge every time, because sometimes when a row, for example, is very close to the cast on or the bind off, it might not be representative of your actual gauge. So this is one more reason why your swatch should be large enough and not like this size, for example. Yes, so what can you do if you have carefully made a swatch and waited for it to dry, or treated it in any other way that you would have treated your finished object, and then you see that your gauge doesn't fit the gauge suggested in the pattern. So what can you do? Well, if both the stitch and the row gauge that you have is smaller than the actual gauge, so let's say the gauge was, as our example was the whole time, 24 stitches and 30 rows, and in your swatch you only have 22 stitches and let's say 26 rows. So they are both smaller numbers than the one given in the pattern. In that case, you can just go down a needle size, or 1 or 2, or how many needle sizes that you need to. You might need to swatch several times, and with a little luck, using a different needle size, you will get the gauge that is stated in the pattern. Same thing if you have a gauge where both numbers, both row and stitch gauge, are higher than actual suggested. So our pattern was 24 stitches and 30 rows, and your swatch is 26 stitches and 32 rows. So in this case, you can just use a smaller needle size and just swatch again, maybe do it 2 times, 3 times, until you either hit the gauge or your gauge will be smaller than the suggested one. So one little piece of advice when you try to swatch in a different needle size: if you're using the yarn that is suggested in the pattern and don't get gauged with the suggested needles, that's really no problem at all. As I said, just use a smaller or larger needle. But if you are using a different yarn than suggested in a pattern, then you could also go up or down 1 needle size. But if you have to go up or down like a significant difference in needle size, like 3 or 4 sizes, then I would really recommend checking if the yarn that you are using is like a good substitute for the yarn suggested in the pattern, because it most likely is not. I have another episode, in an earlier episode, I talk about yarn substitution and how you can find a good substitute for a yarn that is suggested in a pattern. And if you are working a pattern in a different yarn and you have to use a needle that is very, very different than the one that the designer used, then it is rather obvious that the yarn that you're using is not a good substitute, so you might want to check that out. So of course the situation is a little more difficult if you have made your swatch and you have either exact row or exact stitch gauge but not the other. Well, in that case, you can obviously not change your needle size, because the one measurement that was correct before will also change. So I would say the only actual option that you have is try swatching with a different yarn. If you have no increases or decreases at all, like no shaping at all, then you can just add or subtract some rounds to your project and you will be fine. Otherwise, if you have a project with increases or decreases, I personally would definitely swatch a different yarn until I get the gauge that I want to have. So are there projects where you can get away without swatching at all? Yes, there certainly are. And that are any kind of projects that don't need to fit a certain body type. So for example, a scarf, a long rectangular thing. You can certainly make that scarf without swatching, and even if the measurement is a little off, like the width of the shawl is a few centimeters longer or shorter, you will still get like an awesome shawl. If the length is not quite as you hoped it would be, you can just add some rows until it is. Same thing for shawls, no matter if they are crescent-shaped shawls or triangular shawls, and also for blankets, of course. All those things you can work without swatching. On the other hand, are there projects where you cannot get away without swatching? Yes, definitely, as I said, for any kind of project that includes shaping. So definitely sweaters, hats, socks, all those kind of things that need to fit a certain area of the body. Those things you have definitely to make a swatch for. Now let's talk about the reasons why I personally love swatching. I really enjoy swatching a lot, and I really hope that I can inspire you to start swatching if you're one of the people who don't enjoy it so far. So first of all, I really like to knit stress-free, so to know that the garment that I make will really fit me, most definitely absolutely fit me because I have the right gauge, is really comforting for me. But if you love the thrill of that, might be not the argument to convince you, but I have more. So what I really like is to see when I swatch a yarn with a different needle, to see how the fabric behaves. Like in this swatch you can see, I know is it the right way around, like this, you can see that it is really drapey. Like it wraps around my hand right away. Whereas this swatch is rather stiff, you know, it doesn't wrap around my hand almost at all. It almost stands up like a tent or something. So I know, even though I love the stitch pattern, this fabric is not suited very well for like a floaty cardigan, but much rather for the hat that I'm actually making. While this fabric is perfect for a large shawl or a cardigan like that, and might not be the ideal choice for a hat project. So especially if you work with a substitute yarn, you can see in the swatch if you really like the fabric that the needle size and the yarn create. That is something that you will definitely get not without having swatched before, and you might only notice afterwards that even if the gauge is correct, you might not like the fabric it creates because it is either too see-through and too loose, or too tight and will not have the drape that you want in this project. And also I think it is very lovely to see which stitch patterns actually work with different yarns. So let's have a look at this, for example. These are both stockinette swatches. So there's just stockinette stitch. But still, I feel in this swatch, the stitches are much more visible, while in this swatch, they blend into each other very well. So depending on what kind of effect I want to have, I might like one yarn a lot better than the other. So if you look at this, which is Plötulopi, then it is not as visible in the camera because I think it increases the contrast a little bit, but the stitch pattern in this swatch is not as defined as it is, for example, in this swatch. And that is because this yarn here has quite a bit of twist, while this one is an unspun yarn with no twist at all. So while swatching, you get an impression of how a certain stitch pattern works in a certain yarn, which for me as a designer is a very important thing, but also for you when you're knitting with a substitute yarn, you might want to have the same look of a certain sample of a designer, and if you use a substitute yarn, you really can see in your swatch if the stitch pattern is as visible or as invisible as you want it to be, or if it is very, very different from the designer sample. So this is a huge advantage of swatching. And finally, one thing that I personally like when I make swatches is that I have kind of this little like library or diary of projects that I have made. So I have shown you like a few of my swatches in this episode, but I actually have much more, like so much more swatches. And I especially really like it if I, for example, gave an item away to a friend and I still have the swatch, that I kind of can go through my swatches and remember all the projects that I made. Or if I swatched something and it did not work in the yarn that I was using for that swatch, I still might like the idea, the stitch pattern or the shaping that I've done, and my swatches kind of are like a huge box of inspiration for me, so I can go back to them, look through them and see what ideas I have played with and go back to them in some point at the future. So they are kind of both a trip to memory lane and also kind of a source of inspiration for me, and I really enjoy that. As always, at the end of each episode, I would like to introduce you to another knitter, podcaster or designer, and in this week I would like to introduce you to Whitney from Knitted by Whitney. You can both find her on Instagram and also on YouTube. She is a very talented knitter and a lovely person, and she has this fun knitting podcast that you should definitely check out. Recently she released a video where she shares a lot, I think it was about 50 or something, like a huge number of size inclusive knitting patterns, and that was so fun to watch. And also in general, she always has lovely content. She sometimes shares what she reads and shows her knitting projects, and it's something that you really might enjoy as well. So you might want to check Whitney's account out. So there you go. Thank you so much if you have watched all the way till the end of this episode. I really appreciate it. It would mean a lot to me if you would consider subscribing to this channel. It really helps me out. If you don't have a YouTube account, then it would also help if you would share this podcast with your friends if you enjoy it. And as I said, you can also find me on Instagram. And I really enjoy spending my time with you, and I hope this podcast is helpful to you. I'm always open to suggestions for future episodes. So if you have any topic at all that you would like me to address in a future episode, please let me know in the comments. So thank you very much. I will see you next time. Bye.